to hidden PAC money and secret real estate schemes. In front of millions, Mace is left speechless, as the very scandal she came to unveil explodes under her own name. How did a political ambush turn into the most public self-destruction Congress has seen in years? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Under the high, echoing ceilings of room 2123 in the Rayburn House office building, the air hung dense. Not with heat, but with tension. The hearing had been scheduled as a routine review of campaign finance practices, specifically the use and abuse of PAC money. But everyone knew it wouldn't stay routine. It was Nancy Mace who had demanded the session, pushing for a full investigation into what she called progressive corruption, claiming certain Democrats had funneled campaign funds into personal gain. She came in ready to make a spectacle, dressed sharp, posture taller than usual, with a tone sharpened by days of pre-written talking points. Cameras from C-SPAN and CNN had arrived early, microphones tested and ready. The gallery was filled to capacity, journalists, activists, interns, and a handful of major donors, each one sensing that today wasn't going to follow the usual script. But what no one knew, what not even Mace herself suspected, was that Jasmine Crockett, seated quietly at the far end of the committee table, held a folder in her lap that could flip the entire narrative. It was thick, tabbed, and damning. She hadn't leaked it to the press. She hadn't warned her colleagues. And she hadn't said a word, yet. But the silence around her wasn't passive. It was loaded, controlled, deliberate, and it was about to change everything. A staffer adjusted a mic. A young congressman fidgeted. The chair cleared his throat. Normally, these things started with posturing and social media lines, but today felt different. Mace took her seat with confidence. Jasmine remained still, eyes steady, unreadable. A reporter leaned in, whispering, "Crockett's too quiet." Then the gavel fell. One woman came to control the story, the other came to end it. And by the time it was over, only one would walk out with her legacy intact. And just like that, the room shifted. It wasn't loud or obvious. There was no gasp, no outburst, but it was there. You could feel it in the way the reporters leaned forward just a bit farther, in how the aides' fingers hesitated above their keyboards. The rhythm of the hearing had changed. Jasmine Crockett didn't pound the table or raise her voice. She simply exhaled, looked to the chairman, and spoke. Her tone was measured, almost gentle, but every word carried weight. It wasn't performance, it was precision. "Mr. Chairman," she began, "before we proceed with broader claims, I believe it's important we examine the integrity of our own practices, starting with Representative Mace's campaign expenditures." The sentence landed like steel wrapped in silk. Jasmine didn't blink, didn't pause to scan the room for approval. Her focus was singular. For a hearing meant to investigate so-called progressive misuse of funds, her pivot was not only unexpected, it was piercingly direct. It wasn't just a rebuttal, it was a mirror. No one interrupted her. Not yet. The words landed like a cold gust, someone would later write in a blog post. But in the room, it felt more like the moment just before glass shatters. No one expected the first shot to come from her side of the aisle, Jasmine continued, flipping open a folder lined with color-coded tabs. But Jasmine wasn't improvising. She wasn't playing defense. She was holding live ammunition. Her fingers moved with a calm, practiced rhythm, revealing the first document, a payment authorization form and its accompanying FEC report. According to public FEC filings, she said, her voice unwavering, over $78,000 was routed to a consulting firm named Palmetto Beacon Strategies. It has no website, no staff, and no physical address. I placed 3 calls. All went to voicemail. The reaction was immediate, not loud but visible. A few journalists sat up straighter. One member of the committee raised an eyebrow. Staffers behind Mace began to look at one another, unsure whether to type faster or freeze. Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't even look at the ripples she was causing. She simply turned to the next tab. Another sheet, another question. A follow-up, this time with attached receipts and a highlighted calendar entry. She kept going. There's also a $12,400 transaction categorized as constituent outreach. Yet it coincides with a private flight to Scottsdale, Arizona, and a 4-day stay at the Phoenician, one of the most expensive resorts in the state. Her gaze lifted slowly, deliberately, until it met Mace's across the room. There's no record of a town hall, no meetings, no public schedule, she said, her voice now edged with something cooler, sharper, not anger but purpose. Just one line in the expense report: strategic presence. Mace shifted in her seat. She tried to smirk, but it didn't stick. Her jaw was tight, her knuckles pale. A few committee members lowered their pens. Others started writing faster. In the gallery, even the sound of phones tapping seemed to fade beneath the pressure building at the table. And Jasmine? She remained still, not triumphant, not smug, but rooted. Because this wasn't about political points. It wasn't about sound bites or social media virality. It was about something much heavier. This was about holding up a mirror to a system that pretended to clean house, while sweeping its own mess under the rug. And Jasmine Crockett had just flipped that rug over. The shift from tension to eruption was instantaneous. Jasmine's calm dismantling of the expense report had landed too cleanly, too quietly, and for Nancy Mace that silence was unbearable. She lurched forward in her chair, her voice ricocheting off the stone walls like a shot fired in a narrow canyon. "This is a political hit job," she snapped, hands slicing through the air. "A disgraceful partisan stunt." There was no buildup, no warning, just fury, raw and ragged. Her finger pointed straight across the table at Jasmine, the kind of gesture that teetered on the edge of personal attack. "You're using this platform to score headlines. That's all this is. Cheap theater wrapped in manufactured outrage." Her words came fast, too fast, as if outrunning a truth she wasn't ready to face. The pitch of her voice climbed with each syllable, and while she aimed for righteous indignation, what leaked through was panic. A calculated politician losing control of the room she once commanded. Behind her, her aides stiffened. One of them leaned toward the other, whispering something that was met with a subtle shake of the head. A camera shifted angles. A journalist scribbled the word defensive and underlined it twice. But all of it, the shouts, the accusation, the noise, crashed against a wall of silence. Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't roll her eyes or raise a brow. She simply waited, letting Mace's words run their course like a wave breaking on a seawall. And when the shouting stopped, when the air finally emptied and the echo died, Jasmine leaned into her mic. Not in defiance, not in anger, but with the kind of composure that makes chaos look sloppy. "I have receipts," she said. The words were measured and razor-sharp. Not speculation. It was a sentence made of stone. Not performative, not inflammatory, just immovable. The room stilled again, not out of confusion but recognition. Everyone understood what had just happened. Jasmine hadn't taken the bait. She hadn't returned fire. She had ended the round without lifting her voice. It wasn't just restraint, it was command. Nancy opened her mouth again, but couldn't find the next line. Because in that moment, the argument wasn't between two people. It was between sound and evidence. And only one of them had brought proof. And if the silence after Jasmine's last line had felt heavy, what came next detonated like a controlled explosion. She didn't rush. Instead, Jasmine Crockett reached for a plastic sleeve within her binder, with the precision of someone opening a vault. The folder barely made a sound as she peeled it open, but every eye in the room followed the motion. Her hand rested momentarily on a page inside, not for drama, but to give the room time to brace. "There's one more entry I believe this committee should hear," she said, her voice clear, composed, almost gentle, but unmistakably final. "It's not a document, it's a recording." One word, recording, and it hit like a bolt of electricity through the walls. A low rustle moved through the chamber as jaws tightened and pens halted. People didn't need details yet. The mere existence of the word signaled something nuclear was about to be dropped. Jasmine continued unshaken. "This is a phone call dated March 14th of last year between a senior aide in Representative Mace's office and a real estate developer based in Charleston. During the conversation, the aide discusses legislative support in exchange for personal donations. Specifically, the line reads, quote, "Nancy needs the money for the beach house in Kiowa Island." The room convulsed, not physically, but emotionally. It was like the air got sucked out in one simultaneous inhale, a moment of pure compression, and then an explosion. Nancy Mace's chair scraped backward with such force it cut across the floor like a knife through stone. Her palm hit the table with a brutal crack, rattling the microphones and glass pitchers near her. "That's a lie," she roared, eyes wild, face flushed to the edge of crimson. "That's a fabricated, baseless smear." Her voice didn't just rise, it cracked, like something inside had snapped under pressure. She half stood, hands clenched into fists on the table's edge, as if trying to physically steady herself, or brace for impact. It wasn't a controlled denial, it was raw, unfiltered panic. Rage mixed with something quieter, more dangerous, fear. In the gallery, several heads whipped around, some reporters instinctively raising their phones, unsure if they should record or just witness. A lobbyist in the back blinked slowly, lips parted. The accusation was heavy, but the reaction? That told its own story. Jasmine didn't so much as flinch. She didn't respond, didn't lean in, didn't fight back. Her silence was louder than the outburst, because in that moment, she didn't have to say a word. The evidence spoke for her, and the room knew it. "Order!" the chairman snapped, banging the gavel like a hammer onto cold steel. "Order in this chamber." His voice cut through the chaos, sharp and necessary. "Representative Mace, sit down immediately." The silence that followed wasn't ordinary. It was brittle, still, the kind of silence that only comes after someone's mask has cracked, and everyone saw it happen. The silence that followed the chairman's gavel didn't fade. It thickened. It didn't reset the room. It redefined it. There was no more pretending this was business as usual. The facade had cracked, and now every breath, every glance across the chamber carried a different weight. Yet Jasmine Crockett didn't lean into the drama. She didn't look for validation from the cameras or seek affirmation from her colleagues. She simply turned another page. Her fingertips brushed the edge of a document sleeve like a surgeon choosing her next instrument. The moment wasn't loud, but it was seismic. Her voice returned, calm and composed, as if the last 5 minutes hadn't detonated a political grenade. "Let's return to the financial records," she said. The restraint in her tone made the words feel even sharper. It wasn't a demand. It was a pivot with purpose. "We have traced a series of transactions from multiple political action committees, Freedom Coast PAC, Coastal Majority Fund, and Liberty Values Alliance, all routing funds to a firm called Low Tide Strategies." She stopped there, not for theatrics, but for gravity, then added slowly, "A firm that shares an address, suite and all, with a real estate company owned by Representative Mace's ex-husband." A murmur tried to rise in the gallery but died before it could find voice. It wasn't just the connection that hit hard, it was the specificity. Jasmine wasn't casting shadows. She was turning on the floodlights. "According to property tax records and FEC filings," she continued, lifting the next sheet from her binder, "Low Tide Strategies received over $230,000 between 2020 and 2023. In that same window, 3 residential properties were acquired, 2 in Bluffton, Georgia, and 1 in Beaufort, South Carolina. None of these appear on Representative Mace's public disclosure forms. There was no need for speculation. Jasmine laid the evidence down like a prosecutor who knew the defense had no rebuttal. She didn't need raised volume or pointed fingers. She had chain of custody documentation, bank logs, and sworn registration forms. She had page numbers, dates, addresses, and one by one, she placed them into the record with surgical calm. Across the room, something small but unmistakable shifted. A Republican member of the committee, who until now had seemed more focused on his phone than the proceedings, sat upright. His pen, which had been idle, moved across his legal pad with sudden urgency. His brows knitted, the way they do when realization is no longer deniable. He glanced briefly at Jasmine, then at Mace, then back at the paper, writing faster. The room didn't erupt. It recoiled, because Jasmine wasn't asking for a reaction. She was issuing a reckoning, one document at a time. The paper trail had stunned the room, but Jasmine wasn't finished. If the financial records had cracked the surface, what came next drove a chisel straight through it. She didn't raise her voice or shift her posture. She didn't need to. Instead, Jasmine reached into the final sleeve of her binder with the same quiet confidence she'd maintained since the hearing began. From it, she pulled a color printout, an 8.5 by 11 still frame, professionally lit, undeniably real. She held it up with two fingers, steady and deliberate. The room followed her hand as if drawn by gravity. "This photo," she began, her voice low but razor-precise, "was taken at a private fundraising event held on April 19th of last year. In it, Representative Mace is seated with three registered lobbyists tied to the pharmaceutical industry." The image didn't require elaboration. It spoke for itself. Mace sat smiling at a corner table, cocktail glass in hand, surrounded by men in silk ties and designer cufflinks. Behind her, a banner partially visible, a pharmaceutical logo, blurred but still identifiable. Jasmine took a step forward. The setting is an exclusive rooftop venue in Charleston. The image was posted briefly to a LinkedIn profile belonging to one of the attendees. It was deleted within the hour. She paused. Not for effect, but for truth to breathe. "But not before a copy was archived," she added, laying the photo face up before the committee clerk. She flipped to the next page with chilling calm. Alongside the photo is an internal email obtained from a whistleblower with the subject line, "Mace, sponsor H739 before May." That bill, as this committee is aware, would have extended patent protections for a class of high-cost specialty drugs. The effect was instantaneous, but this time there was no gasp. Just stillness, heavy and unmistakable. People didn't need it explained. The implication was clear. Access bought, influence traded, legislation timed to favor an industry worth billions. In the third row, a seasoned political reporter lowered her pen, stunned. Across the aisle, a junior staffer's phone buzzed with a single text. She just connected the dots. Then came the avalanche. A Politico reporter began typing with both hands. MSNBC sent an internal Slack alert. In the media gallery, the words "photo bombshell" and "Crockett delivers proof" spread like fire through a dry field. Phones lit up, not for distractions, but for dispatches. Jasmine didn't acknowledge the stir. She didn't shift her weight, didn't glance at the headlines already being written. She looked straight at the committee, still calm, still controlled, but now unmistakably cutting through layers that others had long protected. She wasn't just presenting evidence. She was confronting a culture, one where favors were currency and silence was survival. But today, silence had been broken. And just when the silence felt unbearable, just when the weight of that photo and the damning subject line began to settle into something irreversible, Nancy Mace struck back. It wasn't the defense of someone standing on firm ground. It was the reaction of someone slipping, fast, and trying to claw her way back to the surface. Her voice sliced through the tension in the room, brittle but loud. "This isn't about truth," she snapped, her words hitting the air like shrapnel. "This is about you trying to score points with the media." She leaned forward now, eyes narrowed, jabbing a finger toward Jasmine as if accusation could erase evidence. "You're not here for oversight. You're here for optics. You want headlines. You want the soundbite. Congratulations. You got it." The words came like a flurry of punches, thrown not to win, but to distract. Her tone betrayed what her posture tried to mask. Fear. Not of Jasmine, but of what had just been made undeniable. "This whole thing is a setup," she continued, her voice rising in pitch. "A pre-scripted performance." And yet, Jasmine didn't even blink. She didn't flinch or glance toward the cameras Mace was accusing her of performing for. She simply looked at her, still, composed, unshaken. In that gaze was something stronger than rebuttal. It was refusal. Refusal to be baited, to be dragged into theater, to let rage rewrite fact. Because Jasmine hadn't come for a moment. She'd come for accountability. And while Mace hurled accusations like broken glass, Jasmine stood untouched, not because she was protected, but because she was prepared. But as Nancy's accusations echoed and fell flat, something shifted, not in volume, but in voltage. It was the kind of moment that didn't need to be announced. The air itself changed. The gallery, the committee, even the staffers who'd been quietly glued to their screens, they all felt it. Jasmine Crockett had held back through slander, accusation, even personal attacks. She had let the evidence speak, let the silence settle. But this time, she wasn't going to let the insult walk past unchallenged. She straightened, not dramatically, just enough to be unmistakable. Her tone didn't rise, her words didn't rush, but the sharpness in her delivery sliced through the room with surgical clarity. "You're not angry because I lied," she said, locking eyes with Mace. "You're angry because I told the truth in public." And then came the line that would echo beyond that chamber, replayed on news shows, looped in headlines, quoted in town halls. "And you talk about sound bites, but you've been treating your voters like an open wallet. You're not serving them. You're spending them." She paused just long enough for the press to glance up, for the committee to register that they were no longer in a standard proceeding. "You're using your constituents like a purse you never intend to return." There was no need to shout. She didn't deliver it for drama. She delivered it like a verdict. And that's when the shift became irreversible. No one moved, not even Nancy. For once, her rebuttal didn't come, not because she didn't want to speak, but because anything she said now would sound like noise crashing into a wall of truth. The chairman didn't gavel. He didn't have to. The room had already submitted itself to a higher authority. Raw, unfiltered clarity. What had started as a policy hearing had cracked wide open into something far more elemental. A confrontation between image and integrity. And the cameras captured every second of it, not as performance, but as testimony. Because what was unfolding wasn't political theater anymore. It was political consequence, happening live. And just when it felt like the floor couldn't drop any lower, Jasmine reached for the final page. There was no need for theatrics. No need to raise her voice or lean in. By now, the weight of her words had already shifted the gravity in the room. Every movement she made, every pause, every paper turned, carried the tension of a blade being unsheathed 1 inch at a time. She slid a single document from a sealed sleeve, the corner marked with a tab in bold red ink. Her hand moved with the calm steadiness of someone who already knew what came next. The room followed her motion instinctively, the kind of stillness that comes when even breath feels like a disruption. "This," she said evenly, placing the paper down with care, "is a preliminary agreement drafted between Representative Mace and a Nevada-based energy conglomerate, Ridgecrest Resources." She didn't look around the room. She didn't need to. Her eyes remained on the text, but her voice carried the full force of what was unfolding. The document outlines non-public support for legislative incentives related to federal land use funding. In exchange, Representative Mace was to receive a silent equity stake in one of Ridgecrest's shell subsidiaries, Crestline Aggregate Ventures. She let that hang, not to perform, but because the facts deserve space. The agreement is dated February 7th, just 12 days before she introduced House Bill 482, which proposed federal land leasing relief for energy development in the Southwest. There was no immediate outburst, only the kind of silence that follows impact. Jasmine's next move was deliberate. She flipped the page and exposed the contractual language beneath. "The language is coded," she said, "but unmistakable. Phrases like non-disclosed advocacy and pass-through incentives tied to resource allocations don't leave much room for misinterpretation." She slid the agreement to the committee clerk, each page face up, each signature placed with care. The signature on this agreement matches 5 other filings from Representative Mace's personal trust, verified by 2 independent forensic analysts. There was no speculation in her tone, no outrage, only fact, stacked like bricks around the truth, forming something unshakable. And in that moment, even the loudest critics in the room could no longer argue the weight of her words. The evidence was no longer just damning, it was undeniable. The moment the clerk took hold of the document, something shifted behind Nancy Mace's eyes, something she couldn't control. It wasn't shock, it was calculation short-circuiting. Her body stiffened as though trying to brace for a blow that had already landed. Her lips parted, searching for a defense. Any defense. But the silence stretched half a second too long, and when the words finally came, they were hollow. "That's a fake," she said, but the tone betrayed her. It wasn't outrage, it was instinct. That's not even my signature. She pushed the claim forward like a failing levee against a rising tide, but no one in the room looked convinced. Not anymore. Not after everything they'd seen. Across from her, Jasmine remained still, unmoving, unreadable. She didn't counter with fire. She countered with fact. Reaching into her binder once again, she removed a single document, stamped, signed, and sourced. No frills, no embellishments. This is a forensic analysis of the signature on the Ridgecrest Agreement, she said, sliding it across the table with precise control. It was conducted by two independent handwriting experts, both certified, both used by federal courts. The results confirm a 96.4% match to Representative Mace's known legal filings, including documents submitted to the Georgia Secretary of State and her personal trust disclosures. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was loaded. For a moment you could hear nothing but the quiet thrum of fluorescent lights and the distant hum of a camera lens adjusting. Then from the back of the press gallery, a single voice escaped in a hushed breath, sharp and stunned. "Oh my God!" It was not commentary, it was confession. From the collective realization that the line had not just been crossed, it had been obliterated. There was no denying the gravity now. This wasn't about politics. This was about evidence. And there, beneath the bright lights and cold silence, truth stood fully revealed. No longer a question, but a fact. The moment the forensic report landed on the record, something inside Nancy Mace ruptured, and this time, there was no containing it. It wasn't the dignified objection of a seasoned lawmaker under pressure. It was something raw, more primal. Her chair scraped violently against the polished floor as she shot up, shoulders tense, chest heaving with unfiltered rage. Her voice broke the heavy silence, not like a gavel, but like glass shattering on stone. "I've been set up," she screamed, her tone unraveling into accusation. "This is a trap, a political hit job. This is filth." The words weren't calculated. They were flung, half defense, half collapse. Her hands trembled as they gestured wildly, as if motion alone could erase what had just been cemented in public record. The mask was off, and what replaced it was panic. Her eyes darted around the hearing room, desperately scanning for rescue. She looked to the chairman. He looked down. She turned toward her own side of the aisle, but no voice rose in protest. No ally reached out, not even a glance. Behind her, reporters froze mid-type, not wanting to miss a second. The cameras stayed locked in. The red recording lights glowed back at her like eyes refusing to blink. Even the marble walls of the room seemed to lean in, not as comfort, but as witness. And still, Jasmine Crockett did not move. She didn't raise an eyebrow, didn't shift her weight. She simply stood, poised and grounded, the quiet force at the center of the storm. If Mace had been trying to create chaos, she had done it, but Jasmine refused to participate, and when she finally spoke, her words didn't crash. They cut. "Truth doesn't need performance," she said, her voice low and even. "It only needs someone willing to speak it out loud." The room didn't breathe. Jasmine wasn't boasting. She wasn't gloating. Her tone wasn't triumph. It was truth, delivered with the kind of steadiness that only comes from knowing you didn't come to win an argument. You came to hold a line. And as her words echoed through the chamber, they left no room for rebuttal, only the echo of what had just been exposed. Nancy stood frozen, her chest still rising with shallow, rapid breaths. For a split second, she looked like she might lash out again, but instead her shoulders dropped and her energy drained all at once. As if her body knew what her voice wouldn't say. It was over. She sat slowly, carefully, like someone afraid the act of sitting down might shatter her completely. Her hands fell to her lap, open, lifeless. Her gaze swept across the dais, one last time, for a lifeline. But the room had turned to stone. Committee members avoided her eyes. Aide after aide stared at nothing in particular. Even the press gallery, once buzzing with clicks and whispers, now held its breath. She was no longer a congresswoman defending herself. She was a figure unraveling in real time, and no one moved to stop it. No one reached out. No one said a word. Because in that moment, everyone understood the same thing. She wasn't being attacked. She was being revealed. And outside that chamber, beyond the heavy wood paneling, beyond the committee silence and unspoken consequences, the world caught fire. It started with a single clip, 12 seconds long, ripped straight from the live stream, posted by a congressional intern who hadn't blinked the entire hearing. In the video, Nancy Mace stood trembling, her voice cracking as she yelled, "I've been set up!" Cut immediately to Jasmine Crockett's icy, deliberate reply, "Truth doesn't need performance. It only needs someone willing to speak it out loud." The edit was clean, brutal, devastating. Within minutes, it was everywhere. Twitter, now X, lit up in real time. TikTok reposted it with captions like "mic drop of the decade." By the time the hearing recessed, the hashtag #Mace Meltdown was climbing past trending. It was erupting. And close behind it came a rush of receipts, "don't lie," often paired with a screenshot of Jasmine calmly sliding a document across the table. Lips pressed, gaze unwavering. Cable news scrambled to catch up. MSNBC cut into regular programming. Fox hesitated, then framed it as another political ambush, though even their evening panel admitted the documents looked damning. CNN aired a split screen of Jasmine's binder and Mace's outburst under the headline, "Documents vs. Denials." The contrast was stark, inescapable. By the top of the hour, nearly every media outlet had clipped, recut, and analyzed the confrontation from at least 3 angles. And the numbers didn't lie. 3.2 million views in the first hour, 11 million by sundown. But the views weren't what mattered most. It was the shift in tone. This wasn't political mudslinging. This was truth weaponized by evidence. And America could feel it. In barbershops in Detroit, in diners in Tallahassee, in airport terminals across the country, people were glued to the footage. Older men who had long tuned out of Washington suddenly found themselves watching every second. "She didn't raise her voice once," one said in disbelief. "That's how you do it." A Vietnam veteran in Louisville played the clip for his son 3 times over, then muttered, "She had her dead to rights." In a church basement in Mississippi, an after-school civics class played it on loop, not because they had to, but because they wanted to understand what accountability looked like. The hashtags weren't just digital noise. They became language. Mace Meltdown wasn't just about one woman losing control. It became shorthand for what happens when entitlement meets consequence. And Receipts Don't Lie wasn't about paperwork anymore. It was about a principle, that if you come to power with nothing but posture and someone shows up with facts, no amount of yelling will save you. But behind the surge, in the quiet spaces Jasmine walked through after the hearing, the noise carried a different tone. She didn't go to a press podium. She didn't hold a victory lap. She went back to her office, removed the binder from her bag, and placed it gently on her desk. Her team sat around her, exhausted but wide-eyed. "You okay?" one of them asked. She didn't answer right away. She just looked out the window for a long moment, then finally said, "It's never the facts that scare them. It's the fact someone is willing to say them out loud." And she was right, because deep inside Capitol Hill, offices began to scramble. Phones rang. Press secretaries drafted talking points. GOP staffers whispered into secure lines, trying to assess just how much damage had been done. But for Nancy Mace, it was already spiraling. Donors paused their checks. Her communications director canceled all media appearances. A junior aide resigned before midnight, citing a moral conflict I can no longer ignore. And journalists, once friendly, now circled her like sharks smelling blood in the tide. In the hours that followed, digital sleuths took the documents Jasmine had submitted and cross-referenced them with public records, campaign filings, and real estate deeds. They found matches, they found timelines, and they found silence from Mace's office, which hadn't issued a single clarification, denial, or legal threat. That silence spoke louder than any press release ever could. Meanwhile, Jasmine became something different, not just a congresswoman, not just a voice of dissent. She became a signal, a warning, a presence. In every news segment, she was described not as angry or aggressive, but as composed, meticulous, relentless. In a political arena built on noise, she had arrived armed with clarity. And clarity, it turned out, was far more dangerous than chaos. By midnight, Mace Meltdown had reached over 200 million impressions, memes exploded, headlines doubled, but underneath the viral storm was a deeper current, an emotional release. People weren't just entertained, they were relieved. They were reminded that power could still be challenged, that evidence could still matter, that someone could stand in a room designed to silence them and be louder without ever shouting. And through it all, Jasmine stayed still. She didn't gloat, she didn't attack, she didn't throw punches, because she didn't need to. The truth had done its work. The public had seen it. The system had heard it. And Nancy Mace, whether she admitted it or not, had felt it. Not all reckonings come with sirens. Some come with paper. Some come with proof. And some, like this one, come with the quiet, undeniable sound of a nation paying attention. But even as the hashtags burned through every corner of the internet, the consequences inside Washington began to move in shadows, quiet, deliberate, and unmistakable. The first sign came not from a press conference or a floor statement, but from absence. The conservative outlets that had once treated Nancy Mace like a rising star suddenly had nothing to say. No op-eds, no defense segments, no sound bites clipped from friendly interviews. The usual anchors who would have rushed to frame the confrontation as a partisan smear instead pivoted to other stories, almost as if they'd been told to. Silence in D.C. is never neutral. It's calculation. It's retreat. Behind the scenes, right-wing media executives were making calls, asking the same question in different tones. Do we want to die on this hill? No one answered yes. Then came the next blow. Financial, not rhetorical. By the second day, at least 4 major donors had quietly suspended contributions to Mace's re-election campaign. A fifth made it public, releasing a curt statement. We take all ethical questions seriously and have chosen to pause our support pending clarity. It wasn't phrased like a condemnation. It was colder than that. It was distancing. Corporate PACs that once bundled checks in her name began erasing her from future event rosters. Private emails surfaced, leaked in fragments to reporters, revealing growing concern among donors about reputational risk and optics spiraling beyond recovery. For a politician who had long sold herself as both principled and electable, that kind of language wasn't just dangerous, it was fatal. And Jasmine? She never once commented. She didn't need to. The machine had already begun turning on its own. In political circles, the most brutal punishment isn't scandal, it's erasure. And Nancy Mace was now walking the early stages of exile. Staffers whispered in elevators. Committee colleagues offered brief nods but avoided eye contact. Her press secretary went dark on social media, deleting 2 weeks' worth of scheduled posts. And still, the drip of consequence wasn't over. Late in the afternoon on day 3, a sealed memo was quietly delivered to the offices of the House Committee on Ethics. Inside was a request, signed by 4 sitting members, including one from her own party, calling for an official review of the allegations raised during the hearing. The language was precise, surgical. In light of the documents entered into public record, we recommend an immediate inquiry into financial disclosures, legislative influence, and donor-linked incentives pertaining to Representative Mace. No cameras were present, no statements followed, but the impact was immediate, because when an ethics investigation opens, it doesn't just examine what was already revealed. It goes deeper, broader, and it signals to everyone paying attention. This isn't going away. The press got wind of it within the hour. Politico broke the story first with a simple, devastating headline. Mace faces ethics review after explosive testimony. Within minutes, CNN confirmed. The New York Times followed with a deeper dive, highlighting previous FEC discrepancies that had once seemed minor, but now under this new light appeared like early smoke from a much bigger fire. And Jasmine? She still said nothing, because what needed to be said had already been entered into the record. What needed to be heard had already echoed through every hallway in the Capitol. She had walked into that hearing with paper, not punches. And now the fallout was speaking louder than any microphone ever could. Inside Mace's office, aides shuffled in and out of closed-door meetings. One longtime staffer left the building with a box and didn't come back. Her scheduler canceled 3 fundraisers. Emails from local Republican leaders stopped being answered. And though Nancy remained outwardly defiant, those closest to her saw it: the tremor in her hands, the fractured pacing in hallways, the late-night calls to lawyers that ended in long, quiet stares through the office window. She hadn't just been caught. She'd been outmaneuvered, outprepared. And now the very system she once weaponized against others was turning inward, slowly, ruthlessly, without mercy. It didn't matter how many speeches she gave. It didn't matter how many headlines she tried to reclaim, because the truth was no longer a claim Jasmine had made. It was now a process the government itself had begun to verify. And in Washington, when truth reaches that level, denial doesn't stop it. It only makes the silence heavier. And as the House Ethics Committee's quiet storm began to gather force, a colder, more personal reckoning took shape. This time in the eyes of the very colleagues Nancy Mace once called allies. There was no formal announcement, no grand gestures of condemnation, just the unmistakable absence of support where it once stood without hesitation. In the hallways of Capitol Hill, Republicans who once publicly praised Mace's independent spine now looked through her as if she weren't there. Elevator doors that used to be held for her now closed a little too quickly. Conversations hushed the moment she entered. Behind the veneer of professionalism, it was exile by omission. Reporters noticed it first. A CNN correspondent posted, "Not one GOP rep has defended Mace on record today, not one." By morning, the silence had become its own story. The few who did speak chose their words like landmines. Representative Caldwell from Texas told the press, "It's best we let the process play out." Senator Rayburn, who once fundraised alongside Mace, simply said, "Every member is accountable to their voters and their record. I'll leave it at that." These weren't just neutral responses. They were escape hatches, pre-cut and rehearsed. No one was willing to go down with her, not when the evidence was this specific, not when the cameras had captured her rage, not when Jasmine Crockett's binder had become the most feared object in Washington. Mace, once a fixture on GOP media panels, now found herself disinvited without explanation. Invitations to think tank dinners vanished. Lobbyists who once lined up to shake her hand in committee hearings now claimed conflicting schedules. Even Freedom Caucus members, known for embracing controversy, offered no cover. One senior member, when asked off the record whether Mace was being abandoned, said flatly, "She's not a cause. She's a liability." And Jasmine? She remained silent, deliberately, powerfully. She had already spoken when it mattered most. Now the system she had confronted was turning its own wheels. Each hour of Republican silence was not just indifference, it was self-preservation. The party had watched one of its own walk off a cliff, and no one was interested in following. Inside Mace's office, staffers felt the chill creeping closer. One aide described the atmosphere as post-apocalyptic. No new statements, no new strategies, just an email inbox full of unreturned messages and phones that stopped ringing altogether. By the third day, only the most loyal held their ground, but even their confidence began to waver. "She's trying to talk through it," one aide whispered, "but no one's listening anymore." The injustice at its core wasn't that Mace was being investigated. It was how fast the people around her disappeared. The same hands that once lifted her campaign signs, that propped her up on talk shows, that echoed her slogans down to the punctuation. Gone. They didn't dispute the facts. They just fled the fallout, one by one, door by door, word by word. And as the dome of the Capitol cast its long shadow over the city that night, Jasmine Crockett's words lingered. Not on TV, but in quiet rooms, whispered by staffers and watched again on phones beneath desks. Truth doesn't need performance. It only needs someone willing to speak it out loud. Washington had heard her. Now it was turning on its own. And as the corridors of power turned cold around Nancy Mace, her name absent from headlines, her allies retreating one by one, Jasmine Crockett did the most dangerous thing a public figure can do in a moment of national attention. She stayed silent. Not out of fear, not out of calculation, but out of discipline. Every major network lined up to give her the floor. CNN wanted an exclusive. MSNBC offered a primetime slot on the readout. Even Fox News reached out, though not out of interest in her side, but to bait her into the same outrage circuit they profit from daily. Her team fielded over 40 media requests in under 24 hours. And Jasmine? She turned them all down. No late-night monologues, no press conference, no self-congratulatory tweets. Just one post, one line. "I don't need to win the argument. I just need the truth to win." She published it without fanfare, without a graphic or campaign logo. Just plain black text on a white background, typed at 2:07 a.m. from a dimly lit office, long after her staff had gone home. But that single sentence cracked through the noise of the American political machine like a church bell in a storm. Screenshots of it were shared over 400,000 times in the first 6 hours. It wasn't just retweeted, it was copied, handwritten on signs, texted between fathers and daughters, spoken aloud in classrooms and churches. Not because it was clever, but because it was true. Jasmine wasn't trying to brand herself. She wasn't chasing momentum. She was grounding it. And in that restraint, something shifted. Not on Capitol Hill, but in the hearts of the people who had watched the chaos and felt for once that someone had spoken not at them, but for them. 3 days later, Jasmine quietly flew back to Texas. No press at the airport, no aides with sunglasses and clipboards. Just a folded navy suit in a garment bag, a half-read binder in her lap, and a short list of community meetings on her calendar. One of them was a town hall, a humble gathering at a local community center outside Dallas. A space with metal folding chairs, plastic coffee urns, and dim fluorescent lights that buzzed with the sound of civic routine. She'd committed to it long before the hearing. She could have canceled. She didn't. When she walked into the room, people stood, not out of obligation, but out of something quieter. Respect. The audience was mostly older. Vietnam veterans in weathered caps, grandmothers in Sunday cardigans, former school teachers with worn notebooks in their laps. They weren't interested in headlines. They didn't come for fire. They came because they had seen something different, and they wanted to know, was it real? Jasmine didn't come armed with new revelations. She didn't bring cameras or campaign staff. She took the mic with no prepared speech. She just looked at the room, row by row, face by face, and let the silence settle before she spoke. "I'm not here to talk about headline," she said, her voice low but firm. "I'm not here to defend what you've already seen with your own eyes." She paused. "Let it breathe. I'm just here to remind us all of something simple." She took one step forward. No podium, no stage, just eye-level truth. "I didn't take anyone down. I just pulled the curtain back so you could see who was performing." There was no applause, not yet, just silence. Full, heavy, electric, because the people in that room weren't waiting for drama. They were waiting for permission to believe again. And Jasmine didn't command that belief. She earned it. It was the kind of moment political strategists can't manufacture. You can't script authenticity, you have to bleed it. A man in the second row, mid-60s, military buzz cut, hands calloused from decades of work, stood up slowly and said, "You didn't just show us her face, you showed us the system." Others nodded. One woman clutched her rosary. A retired firefighter from Fort Worth said aloud, "I never thought I'd give a damn about a House hearing, but you changed that." Jasmine didn't smile. She just nodded, humbly, and kept listening. Because that was the difference. She wasn't there to perform, she was there to be present. Over the next 72 hours, something extraordinary happened. Not in Washington, but in places Washington had long forgotten. Voter registration among adults over 50 in key swing states ticked up for the first time in months. Community forums that usually saw a dozen people show up suddenly overflowed with dozens more, asking real questions, printing out bills, looking at campaign finance reports with fresh eyes. People started searching for the words Jasmine had said, not because they were polished, but because they were clean. No spin, no slogans, just truth that stood on its own. Local newspapers from Amarillo to Athens, Georgia, began writing about her, not as a headline, but as a tone shift. One op-ed read, Maybe the future of politics isn't louder. Maybe it's clearer. And Jasmine? She still refused the national interviews, still declined offers to tell her side, because her side had already been told. Through the facts, through the documents, through the silence of a woman who didn't need to scream to be heard. What she'd exposed in that hearing wasn't just a scandal. It was a blueprint, a challenge, a new standard. And the people who felt it most were the ones who'd given up hope of ever seeing that kind of courage again. In the days that followed, the impact spread, not like a flash fire, but like slow, rising water. It moved through barbershops, VA hospitals, union halls, diners, and late-night text threads between brothers who hadn't voted in 20 years. Not because they were told to, but because something about her made them believe maybe they should. Because what Jasmine Crockett proved was simple, and it was this: truth, when carried with discipline, doesn't need to overpower the room. It doesn't need to crush or humiliate. It just needs to outlast the lie. And that's exactly what it did. Jasmine Crockett didn't disappear. She did something far more unnerving. She stayed completely present, without making a sound. While the political world spun itself into a frenzy, networks scrambling for booking slots, pundits screaming into panels, party operatives refreshing polling tabs every 10 minutes, Jasmine remained still, unmoving, unshaken. Her decision to vanish from the media cycle wasn't retreat. It was precision warfare in a political landscape addicted to chaos. She gave them nothing, not a single press hit, no social media thread, no reactive posturing. She turned down Face the Nation. She declined CNN's Sunday special. MSNBC offered her a full segment on the readout, packaged with a studio team and 2 editorial rewrites. Her team politely declined, citing scheduling conflicts, which was code, of course, for not today, not like this. To every traditionalist inside the Beltway, it was a baffling move. This was her moment. The spotlight was hers. She could have controlled the news cycle for 2 weeks straight, and yet she walked away from it like a soldier refusing a medal, because Jasmine understood something her critics never would. When the truth is on your side, silence isn't weakness, it's dominance. The country had already heard her. More importantly, they had seen her stand calm while chaos roared, seen her hold the line while power buckled. The binder, the documents, the quote that had detonated across social media, "I don't need to win the argument, I just need the truth to win," was already doing the work, and she knew better than to try to outshine it. Because in America, sometimes what you don't say says everything. While her opponents scrambled to spin, Jasmine made a conscious decision. No victory tour, no celebration, no claim of moral superiority. She wouldn't fight spin with spin. She would let the evidence speak. And that strategy, so radical in its restraint, rattled DC more than any media blitz ever could. By staying silent, Jasmine flipped the dynamic. The moment the cameras realized she wasn't coming to them, they began racing to fill the gap. They replayed her clips, re-aired her statements. Suddenly, networks that had once ignored her were running hours of footage featuring a woman who hadn't said a single new word in days. Editorial boards tried to guess her next move. Strategists begged her team for comment, and every unanswered call only made her presence louder. What Jasmine had done in that hearing wasn't just expose Nancy Mace, it was expose the playbook, the noise, the distraction, the way politicians danced around accountability using media cycles as shields. And then she rejected the same tools the system handed her. She didn't just defeat the performance, she refused to join the stage at all. And in that refusal, she did something rare. She earned the trust of people who had stopped trusting anyone. In Cincinnati, a retired federal employee named Grace told her local paper, "She said what she had to say, and then she shut up and let the facts breathe." That's leadership. In a Phoenix VFW hall, a group of veterans paused between pool games to talk about that congresswoman with the calm eyes, wondering aloud if she might be the real thing. In Scranton, an 83-year-old former judge wrote a letter to the editor that read simply, "She reminded me what it looks like when someone takes their oath seriously." This wasn't fandom, it wasn't charisma, it was reverence born from clarity. Because Jasmine had walked into the lion's den, not with rage, not with volume, but with evidence. And then she did the most dangerous thing anyone can do in modern politics. She let the truth stand alone, not diluted by explanation, not clouded by post-game analysis. Just present, unapologetic, fully documented. It began to have a strange effect on the very media she'd ignored. Political talk shows started quoting her despite having no new material. Podcasts built entire episodes around her decision not to speak. One anchor on C-SPAN said aloud, "You know it's bad when the woman with the binder walks away, and you still can't stop talking about her." And that was the point. Jasmine didn't walk away. She just walked through and left the wreckage behind her. Inside the Capitol, her silence made the oxygen thinner. Colleagues were used to spin, to drama, to firestorms that fade. But Jasmine's restraint created an entirely different atmosphere. Accountability that couldn't be chased away by noise. Staffers from both sides began quietly requesting copies of her materials. Younger aides circulated clips of her quote about truth not needing performance. A quiet phrase emerged among first-term legislators. Pull a Jasmine. It meant show up, be precise, say less, bring proof. And outside the halls of Congress, in coffee shops, barber shops, and community centers, her name kept coming up. Not as a celebrity, but as a standard. People didn't talk about Jasmine the way they talked about other politicians. They didn't ask what party she belonged to. They asked, is she really like that? And when they heard she turned down CNN, Fox, and MSNBC, the answer landed deeper than any party platform ever could. She wasn't chasing the narrative. She was choosing the truth. In Philadelphia, a group of black clergy held a closed-door meeting, not to endorse Jasmine, but to dissect her method. One said, she didn't raise her voice, but she raised the temperature of the entire room. In Minnesota, a civic group called the Receipts League was formed by retired librarians who began holding monthly accountability sessions for their city council, modeled directly after Jasmine's hearing approach. We're not yelling, one of them said. We're just bringing the binder. And all the while, Jasmine didn't post another word, not a quote, not a retweet, not even a photo from the town hall in Texas where the elderly veterans had quietly nodded at her like she was one of their own. Because Jasmine understood something few politicians ever will. If you say the truth at the right time, you don't have to say it again. The system would never understand that. It ran on noise, on cycles, on saturation. But Jasmine's strategy was different, and it terrified the system because it worked. She hadn't beaten Nancy Mace by yelling. She hadn't gone viral by accident. She had let facts be the flame, and silence be the accelerant. And now, with no microphone in her hand, no camera in her face, and no agenda on her lips, Jasmine Crockett had become the most watched and most feared woman in American politics. Not because she was loud, but because she wasn't. No one saw it coming. Not the pollsters, not the pundits, not even the parties that had long considered this demographic politically dormant. But the shift was real, and it was spreading. At first it was quiet, just a ripple. A handful of local voter registration offices reported an uptick in middle-aged applicants, mostly unaffiliated, mostly first-timers or long-absent voters. In a small town outside Des Moines, the county registrar noticed that most of the forms were signed in shaky cursive. She smiled, almost confused. "These are the folks who stopped voting after 2008, she said. "Now they're coming back." The spark, of course, was Jasmine, not her politics, not her party, her presence, her proof, her poise. Something about the way she stood, unshaken, unwavering, unchained from the performative fury that had consumed Washington, hit a nerve. Not in the viral way, in the visceral one. For too long, older voters had been fed a binary, shout louder or tune out. They'd seen their concerns turned into sound bites, their dignity packaged into campaign promises never meant to be kept. But Jasmine didn't offer a slogan. She offered something they hadn't seen in years, a sense of order. She brought the receipts. She named the names. She said the truth, not dramatically, but exactly. And when she stepped back instead of stepping up to the cameras, something inside millions of Americans quietly lit up again. If she's willing to do her part, maybe it's time I do mine. In Omaha, a retired electrician named Dan brought a stack of old newspaper clippings to his American Legion Hall. We used to care about what went into the budget, he said. Now all we get is noise. But she made it quiet. She made it clear. In Asheville, North Carolina, a grandmother of 6 sat her entire family down after Sunday church and made them watch the full congressional hearing on YouTube. When her eldest son asked her why, she said, because she didn't raise her voice, and still every man in that room had to listen. Across the country, civic groups that hadn't met in years began dusting off their folding tables and printing their bylaws. Not for protests, not for rallies, but for something far more radical in 2025 America: discussion, deliberation, due diligence. A group of retired school teachers in Lansing started holding weekly binder briefs where they would go over local government expenditures and compare them to Jasmine's method of oversight. In a Pennsylvania county where turnout among seniors had dropped 30% since 2016, voter registration for the over 50 demographic surged 11% in 1 week. The awakening wasn't loud, but it was deliberate. And it wasn't built on hope. It was built on consequence. What Jasmine had exposed wasn't just corruption. She had exposed the cost of giving up. And millions of Americans, gray-haired, often ignored, mostly written off as stuck in their ways, realized that for the first time in a long time, someone in that hearing room had been speaking for them. Not at them, not around them, not over them. For them. It wasn't a movement built in stadiums. It was one born in coffee shops, book clubs, community centers, and kitchen tables. People began printing out budgets again. Not memes, minutes. Not TikToks, transcripts. And they didn't ask who Jasmine voted for in the past. They asked who had the courage to do what she did in that room. To say, I'm not here to destroy anyone. I'm here to pull back the curtain so you can see who's been performing. That sentence became a battle cry, not against politicians, against politics as theater, because people weren't angry. They were ready to watch closer, ready to ask sharper, ready to vote quieter, but with precision. This wasn't a revolution. It was something older, deeper, more stubborn. It was a reckoning with apathy. And it started with one woman, holding a binder, standing in truth, and then walking away while America finally leaned in. And as the quiet wave of middle-aged voters began reshaping the civic landscape, not with slogans, but with substance, what lingered beneath it all was something deeper than politics. It was a lesson, a human one. Because beyond the headlines, beyond the hearings, beyond even the silence Jasmine wielded like a blade, this story wasn't just about corruption or courage. It was about the cost of carrying truth in a room built to punish those who do. Jasmine Crockett didn't walk into that chamber expecting applause. She walked in knowing the weight of every document in her binder. She knew what it meant to stand alone. She knew that telling the truth doesn't just challenge power, it exposes it. And the moment she laid those papers on the table, she became something every system fears. A mirror held too steadily to be ignored. The world called her brave, but bravery doesn't feel like fire when it's real. It feels like isolation, like stillness in a storm. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't trade barbs. She walked into a chamber full of practiced performers and told the truth with receipts. Not to win, but to warn. To remind us all that democracy isn't held up by volume, but by vigilance. By the people willing to speak when it's easier to stay silent, and by those even more rare, who know when to stop speaking so the truth can finally echo without distortion. The lesson was never about one woman versus one scandal. It was about us, about what we reward, about who we believe, about how easily we mistake noise for strength and polish for integrity. Jasmine didn't just confront a broken system. She exposed how often we let that system survive by letting truth die quietly, under a pile of talking points and distractions. But not this time. Because this time, one woman refused to perform. And in doing so, she reminded a country what real accountability sounds like. Not loud, not angry, just true. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. Inside a nationally televised hearing on Capitol Hill, Jasmine Crockett and Caroline Leavitt clashed over a shocking question. Is the White House responsible for stopping disinformation on social media or quietly enabling it? Leavitt defended the White House's hands-off approach, but just minutes later, Crockett revealed undeniable evidence. The room erupted, the Department of Justice launched a criminal investigation, and Caroline Leavitt's career suddenly hung by a thread. When freedom of speech becomes a shield for deception, who really controls the truth? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. 9 a.m., room 2157, Rayburn House office building. The gavel struck once. The room fell dead silent. Every seat was filled. Journalists, staffers, political operatives, shoulder to shoulder, their faces lit by the glow of live broadcasts. No small talk, no movement, just cameras rolling and tension tightening like a noose. This wasn't just a hearing, it was a battlefield disguised as a policy forum. The topic? White House accountability in combating social media disinformation. But everyone knew it was really about two women, two worlds, and one national reckoning. Caroline Leavitt sat alone at the witness table. No aides, no laptop, just a glass of water and an expression carved from ice. She looked like she'd already won, and maybe that was the point. Her hands were still, her breathing calm, her presence unnervingly composed. She didn't smile. She didn't blink. The cameras loved her because she gave them nothing, and that was everything. 3 minutes late, the door opened. Jasmine Crockett entered like a warning shot. Red blazer blazing, heels cracking against the tile, eyes straight ahead. She said nothing, offered no excuses. She didn't need to. The room tilted toward her without meaning to, because her silence didn't whisper, it threatened. She dropped a thin folder on the table, sat down with precision, and stared straight ahead. No words had been spoken yet, but everyone knew. The storm had arrived. The storm hadn't spoken yet, but when it did, it wasn't Crockett who struck first. It was the ice that cracked the silence. Caroline Leavitt didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her presence was already commanding, but when she finally spoke, the weight of her words carried a precision that sliced through the tension like a scalpel. The White House, she said, leaning forward with slow intent, is not the gatekeeper of thought. She delivered the sentence like a verdict, not a defense. The sentence echoed, flat and unshaken. Her hands remained still, clasped gently before her, yet her gaze was locked, unwavering. It wasn't aggression, it was conviction. We do not filter belief. We do not police opinion. We stand back, even when voices clash, because that's the price of liberty. There was no hesitation, no qualifying language. Leavitt wasn't appealing for sympathy. She was issuing a declaration. The American people have the right to believe anything they want, even if it offends, even if it frightens, because freedom doesn't come with a safety net. She paused, not to search for approval, but to give her audience, especially the one sitting across from her, a moment to process the impact. She was calm, but make no mistake, she was throwing down a gauntlet. To her, chaos was the cost of letting democracy breathe. Her job wasn't to contain the fire, it was to ensure no one stopped it from burning. Across the room, Jasmine Crockett sat motionless, but only on the surface. Her arms folded slowly, deliberately, like a defense mechanism she'd activated 1,000 times before, in rooms where power used charm as camouflage. Her shoulders tensed beneath her crimson blazer, the only color in a room full of navy suits and gray ideals. She didn't interrupt. She didn't raise her hand. But then, just as Leavitt finished her final line, Crockett let out a single unmistakable sound. A laugh. Short. Cold. Not the laugh of someone amused, but the kind that exposes a truth left unspoken for too long. The room didn't stir, but the shift was undeniable. It was the sound of someone who'd spent years watching communities torn apart by what others called free thought. And now, face to face with the architect of that defense, she didn't blink. Her eyes didn't leave Leavitt's face, not for a second. You think this is noble? They seem to ask. You speak of freedom like it's a theory, not something that bleeds. That laugh, sharp and solitary, cut through the space between them, filling it with everything Crockett had chosen not to say. Yet, the tension didn't rise. It condensed, heavy and unmoving. This wasn't a disagreement over talking points or party platforms. It was deeper, older, and far more volatile. It was about who gets to define truth and who pays the price when that truth is weaponized. One woman believed in restraint. The other knew silence could be lethal. And now, under oath, under cameras, they were both about to find out which version of freedom the nation still believed in. The laugh didn't just break the air, it shattered the illusion of neutrality. And when Jasmine Crockett stood, it wasn't a response. It was a reckoning. Jasmine Crockett rose with the kind of deliberate control that made people nervous. Not because she was loud, not yet, but because she was measured. Every second she took to stand was a second the room held its breath. Her chair scraped against the floor. Slow, sharp, final. Her hands, steady but coiled with tension, pressed into the edge of the witness table like she was bracing for impact. She didn't fumble with notes. She didn't clear her throat. She didn't need preparation. She'd been preparing for this confrontation her entire life. The camera zoomed in, but even without the close-up, you could feel it. This wasn't politics. This was personal. She leaned in, barely, but it was enough. Her voice came low at first, sharpened by years in courtrooms where truth was either a weapon or a wound. It didn't rise. It cut. You call conspiracy theories freedom? Her tone wasn't rhetorical. It was a challenge, cold and confrontational. You were a lawyer in Texas. You know the consequences of words, don't you? Those words didn't hang in the air. They slammed into it. The impact was immediate. A few heads turned toward Levitt. Others stared only at Crockett, watching the temperature in the room climb degree by degree. This wasn't a political talking point. This was a woman demanding accountability from another woman who wore silence like armor. Crockett's voice carried the weight of real people, of a teenager in Dallas who believed a lie he saw online and ended up arrested at 17. Of an elderly woman who stopped going to church because someone on X convinced her it was infiltrated by election saboteurs. Of mothers who cried in courtrooms while Crockett stood beside them, not as a politician, but as the only one in the room who didn't flinch when justice got inconvenient. Now she stood not just as a congresswoman, but as a witness to that damage, and the defender of those who never got their day at the microphone. And as she stared at Levitt, she wasn't looking for an answer. She was forcing the room to confront a question it had avoided for far too long. When did we start confusing liberty with neglect? And who gets to clean up the wreckage when the truth is left unguarded? The room didn't move. Crockett's challenge hung in the air like smoke. Dense, suffocating, unspoken judgment pressing down on every chest. But Levitt didn't shift. She didn't recoil, because ice doesn't retreat, it sharpens. Caroline Leavitt didn't blink. She didn't look away. She absorbed Crockett's words like stone absorbs the wind, unbothered, unmoved, dangerously still. Then with a slow, deliberate motion, she leaned into the microphone. No dramatic flair, just the kind of stillness that speaks louder than rage. Her hands remained perfectly folded, her voice low and unwavering, each word shaped like a blade with no wasted edge. I don't censor truth just because it makes someone uncomfortable. The effect was immediate, jarring. Her words didn't echo. They impacted. Each syllable landed like a closed fist, clean and unapologetic. It wasn't a rebuttal. It was a slap wrapped in restraint, and that made it more cutting. Several reporters lifted their heads in sync, instinctively sensing a line that would ricochet across news cycles before the hour was out. Phones vibrated across the gallery. Lenses zoomed tighter. This wasn't just a statement, it was a moment. To some watching, Levitt sounded principled. To others, merciless. But to Jasmine Crockett, those words carried something else, a denial of lived experience. Because beneath the calm, beneath the polish, was a refusal to acknowledge the damage that so-called truth had inflicted on the very people Crockett fought for. Leavitt's statement didn't account for mothers who buried sons after online lies incited violence. It didn't see teachers driven from classrooms because anonymous posts painted them as traitors. It didn't care about the fire, only that the match had been lit freely. Jasmine didn't respond yet, but her silence was not submission. It was pressure building. The weight of every name, every face, every courtroom she'd walked into, where truth wasn't just uncomfortable, it was obliterated. And now across from her sat a woman who wore that erasure-like armor and called it liberty. The storm was circling back, and it would not be quiet for long. Leavitt's words may have drawn lines in policy, but Crockett was done with lines. She was drawing blood now, and this time, she reached for the one thing no script could protect: the truth behind the persona. Jasmine Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her power was in the precision of her words, and in that moment, every syllable was chosen not for volume, but for impact. She leaned forward just slightly, her gaze drilling straight into Leavitt's, not to intimidate, but to disarm. "You're a young mother," she said, calm and cutting, "the youngest press secretary in history." Her voice was steady, but the rhythm behind it pulsed like a warning. The room tightened around her. Reporters stopped typing. The tension wasn't coming. It had arrived. "And you work for a man who once stood at a podium and told an angry crowd to fight like hell. A president who lit a fuse beneath this country and watched it burn from behind bulletproof glass. It wasn't a gotcha. It wasn't grandstanding. It was a gut punch disguised as a question." Crockett wasn't digging into the past to humiliate. She was reaching for the humanity behind the mask. Her words came slow but deliberate, each one layered with the weight of lived experience. You sit there speaking about freedom," she continued, voice tightening. "But tell me, do you really believe in what you're doing? Or are you just playing your part because you think keeping your job means keeping your power?" The way she said power wasn't accusatory, it was exhausted, like someone who'd watched too many good people trade conviction for convenience. And that's when the shift happened. Not in volume, but in temperature. Crockett's tone softened, but her words turned lethal. "You're a mother. You know the difference between chaos and care." Her voice trembled, not from nerves, but from the unbearable clarity of what was at stake. It wasn't just about politics anymore. It was about the recklessness of people in suits who got to walk away while others buried the consequences. "So I'll ask again, do you truly believe in what you're defending?" The words didn't need to echo. They sank, heavy, inescapable. Crockett stood in that silence, not to wait for an answer, but to prove one was overdue. Because behind the calm of Caroline Leavitt sat a machine, slick, composed, unyielding. But across from her stood a woman who had seen too much, lost too much, and was no longer willing to let that machine speak without cost. This wasn't grandstanding. This was survival. And Crockett was speaking for every voice that hadn't made it to a microphone in time. The courtroom-like silence that followed Crockett's challenge begged for reflection. But Leavitt didn't offer that. Instead, she gave something colder, something calculated. She smiled. Caroline Leavitt didn't rush to respond. She sat still, letting the tension wrap itself around the chamber like a wire pulled tight. And then, just as the weight of the moment threatened to collapse into silence, she let out a smile. Not wide, not warm, but controlled, razor-thin, and unmistakably intentional. It wasn't the smile of someone amused. It was the kind worn by people who have spent years in rooms built to deny emotion, to dilute humanity into sound bites. A smile that knew its timing, its optics, and its effect. Her eyes met Crockett's, and though her face was composed, her stare said something else. "You're passionate. I'm prepared." Then came the words, delivered softly but honed to cut. "You ask what I believe in?" She let it hang. No defensiveness, no tremble, just that same unnerving calm. "I believe people don't need to be led by the hand." They weren't just words. They were positioning, a philosophical pivot disguised as humility. She was no longer defending a political administration. She was painting Crockett as the overbearing one. The implication rang out loud, though unstated. "Your desire for control is the real threat." It wasn't a rebuttal. It was a reframing of the entire argument, and it struck with clinical precision. Crockett had built her case on lived experience, on harm, on human cost, but Levitt responded with distance, with a polished belief in individual agency that ignored the systemic rot underneath. And in doing so, she shifted the ground beneath their feet. The debate was no longer about disinformation. It was about dignity. It was about whether protecting people required guidance or restraint, whether passion was a virtue or a liability. The political had just become personal, and as the cameras captured every inch of Crockett's tightening jaw, the crowd watching from home saw it too. Levitt wasn't just speaking, she was dismissing, with elegance, with poise, and with an indifference that cut deeper than any insult ever could. Levitt's calm was a wall, but Crockett didn't come to knock, she came to break it. And when truth is your weapon, you don't whisper. You drop it on the table and make the silence answer to you. Jasmine Crockett moved with a swiftness that came not from rage, but from certainty. There was no hesitation, no flourish, just one motion. Her hand slid under the desk, and out came a thick bundle of paper, color-printed, tabbed, and blisteringly real. The thud as it hit the table snapped the room awake like a gunshot in a church. She opened it without ceremony, the way a prosecutor unveils an exhibit too damning for interpretation. Page after page showed screenshots from X. Violent, manipulative, unmistakably fake. Posts accusing black voters in Georgia of ballot theft. Captions under AI-generated photos suggesting armed uprisings. Even quotes twisted and falsely attributed to sitting members of Congress. But it wasn't just the content, it was the signature. In the metadata, tucked into corners that only someone trained to look would notice, 3 letters repeated like a branding mark, Algo Wait Push. Crockett let the words hang there, unspoken but undeniable. Algorithm, White House, push. This wasn't disinformation simply spreading. This was amplification, coded into the system itself. The implication was radioactive. Someone, somewhere didn't just allow the chaos. They enabled it. Crockett didn't need to explain what that meant. Everyone in the room, every aide, every journalist, every lawmaker, understood the weight of what they were seeing. Gasps were audible. Phones went up. Cameras zoomed in. The chairman's gavel hit wood, again and again, sharp, desperate, ignored. The room was no longer listening to him. They were listening to the evidence. And Crockett, who had waited long enough, lifted her eyes from the pages and stared straight into Levitt's calm expression, searching for the crack that had to be there. Then came the blow, not physical, but louder than any fist. You knew about this, and you let it happen? Her voice didn't just rise, it broke, not from weakness, but from the unbearable pressure of carrying truth alone for too long. There was no posturing, no performance, just the raw, unfiltered voice of a woman demanding an answer, not for herself, but for the people already hurt by the lies Levitt had just called freedom. And in that single moment, it wasn't a hearing anymore. It was a trial, and the jury was watching from every living room in America. The air was thick with accusation, with evidence that refused to be ignored. But while others crumbled under the weight of exposure, Caroline Levitt simply breathed, measured, slow. And then, like ice meeting flame, she responded. Caroline Levitt didn't rush to rebut. She didn't scramble or shrink from the papers stacked before her, heavy with screenshots and implicating metadata. Her fingers brushed the rim of her water glass, her nails barely tapping its surface. A subtle rhythm, as if to remind herself of control. Her expression didn't change, but those watching closely could detect the faint shift behind her eyes. Not fear, not guilt, but something colder. The calculation of someone deciding how much truth the room could handle without cracking. She let the moment hang longer than was comfortable, a silence so deliberate it became its own kind of statement. Then, without raising her voice, she leaned into the microphone, her tone stripped of apology or anger. I let people choose, she said, each word dropped like a polished coin onto stone. Not because I agree with them, but because I respect their right to believe. She didn't blink. Her delivery was clean, surgical. It wasn't a defense, it was a philosophy. And in that calm declaration, Levitt didn't deny the chaos, the damage, the manipulation. She acknowledged it by not flinching from it. To her, that damage wasn't her responsibility. It was a byproduct of freedom, a cost worth bearing for a principle she'd wrapped herself in like armor. She wasn't claiming innocence. She was claiming detachment. But in doing so, she revealed everything Jasmine Crockett feared most, that harm could be ignored if it wore the mask of liberty, that institutions would step back in the name of choice, even if stepping back meant letting the vulnerable fall. Levitt's restraint wasn't cowardice. It was something more dangerous. It was a doctrine, a belief that watching the fire wasn't the same as lighting it, even when you stood beside the gasoline. And as she sat back in her chair, composed as ever, she wasn't just defending her administration. She was defending a worldview where power refuses to intervene, even when silence screams complicity. Levitt's response had been delivered like scripture, clean, measured, final. But in Jasmine Crockett's world, truth wasn't neat, it bled. And when the people you love vanish because of someone else's silence, no doctrine in the world can hold that weight without breaking. Jasmine Crockett's composure cracked not with a scream, but with impact. Her hands slammed against the wood of the table, sending a thunderous bang across the hearing room. Sharp, visceral, final. A stack of papers, statements, evidence, warnings, exploded into the air like shrapnel, fluttering to the ground in a chaotic spiral no one dared interrupt. The gavel didn't move. The chairman didn't speak. Even the reporters stopped typing. All eyes turned to Crockett, not because she had disrupted the process, but because she had broken the illusion that it was still about process at all. Her chest rose and fell in jagged rhythm, as if her lungs had to fight for space against the grief building inside her. And then she spoke, voice quaking, but iron strong at the core. "I lost a friend to lies like these. You don't get to sit there and call that freedom." The room shook, not physically but morally. Her voice didn't just reach the ears in the chamber. It carved itself into the conscience of everyone watching. This wasn't political theater. It was testimony. It was loss laid bare. That friend she spoke of wasn't abstract. He had believed in the lies, in the manipulation, in the posts boosted and echoed by algorithms no one claimed to control. He'd spiraled, doubted, isolated, until one day there was no more spiraling left. He was gone, and Crockett had been the one to take the call, the one to stand by the mother, the one to eulogize a man destroyed by something Levitt now defended as choice. Her rage wasn't noise. It was memory weaponized, a cry not just for justice, but for recognition. She wasn't screaming at Levitt's words. She was screaming at what they erased. And in that moment, amid the scattered papers and stunned silence, Crockett wasn't out of control. She was the only one in the room who still understood what it meant to lose something real. Jasmine Crockett had laid her pain bare, not for sympathy, but for truth. The room had shifted, hearts clenched, breath stalled. But across the table, Caroline Levitt remained still. And in that stillness, something colder than denial emerged: detachment. Caroline Levitt didn't move. Not when the papers hit the floor, not when Crockett's voice cracked from the weight of real loss. She sat upright, hands folded neatly, her face a perfect mask of restraint. The kind of stillness that wasn't born from confidence, but from calculation. She waited 2 seconds, maybe 3, not out of respect, but out of control. And then she reached for the microphone with robotic precision, her voice gliding out without pause or break, steady as ever. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said, tone smooth, almost clinical. "But none of us has the right to decide who gets to speak." The words didn't land like comfort. They landed like policy, like something written into a manual for managing public emotion. There was no inflection, no warmth, just doctrine, unbendable, untouched by context. It was the kind of apology that ends rather than opens conversation. The kind that doesn't heal. It holds a line. And that line, for Levitt, was more sacred than grief, than truth, than consequence. In that moment, she wasn't just defending free speech. She was defending her distance from what that speech destroyed. Around her, the air shifted. It didn't explode, it tightened. People leaned forward not to hear, but to understand how someone could remain so unaffected. Lawmakers glanced sideways. A few aides dropped their pens. Even the chairman, usually stoic, looked momentarily stunned. It wasn't what she said, it was how she said it. As if Crockett's heartbreak, the friends she'd buried, the community torn by lies, were unfortunate, yes, but irrelevant to the principle. Levitt didn't challenge the pain, she simply refused to let it touch her. And in doing so, she drew a line that no one in the room could ignore. A line where freedom didn't just protect speech, it abandoned those hurt by it. Levitt had drawn her line, unmoved even in the face of loss. But Jasmine Crockett had one final card to play, and this one didn't come with emotion. It came with evidence. Jasmine Crockett didn't respond with another outburst. She didn't shout, didn't point, didn't even speak. For a moment, she just breathed. A slow, deliberate inhale, then an exhale, steady and heavy with restraint. Her body, once coiled in fury, now moved with eerie composure. She looked down at the chaos of papers scattered across the table, then back up, eyes sharp, unwavering. With a motion as calm as it was calculated, she reached into the inside pocket of her blazer and pulled out a small metallic USB drive. There were no logos, no markings, just steel, clean and silent, like the truth it carried. She didn't wave it. She didn't announce it. She simply held it up, letting the overhead lights catch its glint, her fingers tight around it like it was a loaded trigger. And her eyes. They were locked on Levitt, not challenging, declaring. It was the stillness that made it terrifying. Because in that moment, the temperature in the room dropped. Not from fear, but from realization. Something had changed. The conversation was no longer theoretical. It was evidentiary. Across the table, Caroline Levitt shifted. It was subtle. A narrowing of the eyes, a sharp breath drawn through her nose. But it was there. The crack. The first visible sign of disruption in a fortress built on stillness. She sat straighter, lips parted slightly, one hand hovering as if to adjust her mic. But she didn't touch it. She didn't know what was on that drive. But she knew what she'd heard behind closed doors. And Crockett had just told the entire nation that those doors were no longer closed. Then in the quietest voice she'd used all morning, Crockett leaned in and spoke. Not to grandstand, but to devastate. "This is the proof," she said. "And you know it." The impact was instant and total. The hearing room, already tense, collapsed into absolute silence. No coughs, no shifting chairs. Even the gavel remained frozen mid-air in the chairman's hand. This wasn't performance, it was a turning point. Everyone in that room, lawmakers, aides, press, understood what had just happened. The USB wasn't a prop. It held a recording, a real one. White House staffers, high level, captured in their own voices discussing how to neutralize damaging narratives by cloaking them in the language of liberty. Not fixing them, not owning them, burying them. They'd weaponized the First Amendment, and Crockett had caught them in the act. And now, holding that truth like a scalpel, she didn't need to raise her voice. She just needed to let the silence do the cutting. The flash drive hadn't just changed the tone of the hearing, it had shattered it. Crockett no longer needed words. The evidence sat between them, glowing with consequence. And for the first time, Caroline Levitt looked like someone who knew silence was no longer enough. Caroline Levitt sat motionless for a moment too long. The courtroom-like tension returned, now heavier, now real. All eyes were on her, Republicans, Democrats, aides, cameras, every reporter in the gallery, watching, waiting, holding their collective breath to see what happened when a wall finally met pressure from within. Her fingers, which had rested like sculpture over one another all morning, moved tentatively. They slid toward the mic with a hesitancy that betrayed what her face refused to show. For hours she had been marble, but now her hand trembled slightly, the weight of consequence finally landing. She pulled the microphone close. It creaked just slightly, and in that soft mechanical whine, something unspoken was laid bare. Control, once absolute, had begun to slip. Her voice came low and for the first time, not entirely stable. "I don't know what that recording contains," she said, each word clipped but softer than before. "But I won't deny it. There are things I don't control. It was a sentence carefully built, measured, restrained, but cracked. Her tone held no confession, no guilt, but also, for the first time, no certainty. The room recognized the shift instantly. Aides stiffened. The chairman sat back slightly in his chair. Crockett didn't move. She didn't blink. Her expression was unreadable, but her silence was louder than anything she'd spoken before. She didn't need to shout anymore. She had cornered the moment. She had forced the room to look at what it had tried to pretend wasn't real. Then came the blow, not from a lawmaker, not from a party, but from the center of the institution itself. The chairman cleared his throat, his voice low but sharp as a gavel. "This committee," he said, "will consider transferring the contents of this USB drive to the Department of Justice for federal review." He paused, giving each word room to reverberate. "Effective immediately." The effect was nuclear. The silence shattered. The press gallery burst into movement, keyboards rattling like machine gun fire. Reporters practically lunged over each other, fingers flying as they live-typed the headline that would set the country on fire. Phones lit up. Live feeds spiked. Producers shouted into earpieces. Hashtags were born in real time. Crockett remained frozen, eyes locked on Levitt like a surgeon watching for a pulse. Levitt blinked rapidly, swallowed, and looked down for the first time all day. Not at the evidence, not at Crockett, but at the table, at nothing. Because in that instant, she wasn't the youngest press secretary in history. She was a name tied to a recording she couldn't disprove. The room was now an electric storm, chaotic, wild, historic. But under all of it, one truth pulsed. Jasmine Crockett had moved the immovable. And in doing so, she didn't just win an argument. She had broken the silence that protected power. The hearing had exploded, but Jasmine Crockett didn't stay to bask in the chaos she'd unleashed. Her war was never about applause. It was about impact. And the moment that impact landed, she walked away. Not as a victor, but as a witness to the cost of truth. The door to room 2157 hadn't opened since the hearing began. But now it swung outward on slow, groaning hinges, as if even the building itself knew the weight of what had just happened inside. And through that doorway walked Jasmine Crockett, alone, unguarded, unshaken. Her steps were not rushed. They were deliberate, measured, as if her body refused to betray the emotional storm just beneath the surface. Behind her, the hearing room remained electric, buzzing with the voices of aides, reporters, and lawmakers scrambling to understand what had just detonated in real time. But Crockett didn't turn back, not once. She didn't need to. Her eyes were damp, not from spectacle, but from release. For hours, she had carried the weight of every mother who had buried a child because of lies, every voter who had been targeted, every friend who had been swallowed whole by propaganda dressed as patriotism. Her face, while composed, bore the silent cracks of someone who had walked through fire not to make a point, but to survive one. There was no victory in her expression, no smugness, only a haunting, quiet exhaustion. The kind you wear when the truth finally lands, but at a cost you know you'll never stop paying. As she made her way down the long, echoing marble corridor, the sounds of the chamber behind her grew distant, then faded entirely. What remained was the steady rhythm of her heels against the stone floor and the invisible burden pressing against her spine, the weight of having said the thing no one else dared say, the weight of being the voice of grief in a room built for power. No cameras followed her now. No one from her staff rushed to wrap her in a coat or offer a tissue, and she didn't reach for one. Her tears didn't fall. They shimmered, held stubbornly at the edges of her vision, restrained like everything else she hadn't said aloud. She reached the end of the hallway and stopped. For a moment she stood still, her back to the door that now separated her from the headlines being written without her. Her jaw clenched softly, her shoulders rose with a single breath, then lowered. She didn't wipe her face. She didn't fix her posture. She didn't pretend to be fine. She just was. And that honesty, raw, unflinching, uninterrupted, was more powerful than any statement she could have made from a podium. She knew what had just happened in that room would ripple. The recording would be subpoenaed. Analysts would swarm cable news. Politicians would pick sides. Some would call her unprofessional. Others would call her brave. But none of them would understand the price. Because the truth, no matter how explosive, never feels like triumph when it's born from pain. It doesn't walk out of a hearing room with confetti. It walks out with blistered feet in a quiet stare. Jasmine turned her head slightly, just enough to catch the reflection of the Capitol dome in the window beside her. It loomed pristine, powerful, untouched by the storm she had just ignited within its chambers. And in that reflection, she didn't see a victor. She saw a fighter, one who didn't need permission to speak, one who didn't need applause to be right, one who, even when the system tried to freeze her out with silence, found a way to speak so loud the whole nation felt it. Her hand went to her chest, fingers curling around the edge of her blazer, as if grounding herself in fabric when the weight of justice had no form. She didn't cry. Not here, not now. The tears would come later, in a car, or in the dark silence of a hotel room, or in the space between two meetings where no one was watching. Because for women like Jasmine Crockett, vulnerability wasn't a weakness. It was a strategy, one held until the battle was over. And for her, the battle was never about a single room. She took another breath, this one deeper. As she began walking again, slower now but steadier, one of the Capitol interns coming down the hall instinctively stepped aside, eyes wide, recognizing something powerful in the silence she carried. He didn't speak. She didn't nod. But the look between them was enough. He knew what had just happened. Maybe not all the details, but the feeling, the seismic shift that takes place when truth rips through power with nothing but a voice and a flash drive, that he felt. And he would remember it long after the headlines faded. Down the stairs, past the security checkpoint, through the echoing rotunda, Crockett walked the way you walk after surviving something no one expected you to endure. There was no need to celebrate. She had delivered the reckoning. She had broken the wall. And now she had to carry what came next. The doubt, the spin, the retaliation. But there was also something else. In the wake of her walkout, in corners of the country far from Capitol Hill, something stirred. A mother watching on C-SPAN felt seen. A voter who'd stopped believing in institutions felt vindicated. A student streaming from a campus library clenched their jaw and said, "That's what courage looks like. Not clean, not polished, but necessary." As she reached the exit and pushed through the heavy double doors, the light outside hit her face, soft, gray, almost cinematic. The world hadn't changed yet, but it would. Because inside a hearing room no one thought would matter, Jasmine Crockett hadn't just spoken. She had intervened. She had turned grief into leverage. And whether they liked it or not, the people in power would have to answer for what they once dismissed as untraceable. She descended the Capitol steps one at a time. No entourage, no security detail flanking her, just the sound of wind against stone and the quiet storm of a woman who had just forced a government to look itself in the mirror. She didn't smile. She didn't wave. She didn't look back. She just walked. And the silence left in her wake was louder than any applause ever could be. Outside the hearing room, Jasmine Crockett had already crossed the threshold, out of battle, into legacy, but inside one figure remained, still, silent, and, for the first time, alone. Caroline Levitt sat completely still. Her hands, once folded with precision, now rested flat on the desk, motionless. The USB drive lay untouched on the table's edge, the weight of its contents pushing down on the air between her and the world she no longer controlled. The reporters were still typing. The chairman had recessed the session. Staffers were gathering files, whispering into phones. But no one spoke to her. No one dared. Around her, the room moved like it was in slow motion, like reality itself had shifted, and no one knew yet how to speak in the new language of accountability. And still, Levitt sat. It wasn't out of arrogance, not anymore. It was the stillness of someone reckoning with a truth they hadn't planned for. Her body was composed, but her face had changed. The edges of her confidence had softened into something else. Tightened lips, a lowered gaze, the slightest tremor in her jaw. She hadn't lost control, but she had lost the illusion of invincibility, and she knew it. The room, so focused on Crockett minutes earlier, now pulsed around her like a vacuum. And yet no one interrupted her silence. Not even the cameras, which panned out slowly, uncertain whether to stay on her or turn away. Finally, after what felt like a full minute of suspended breath, Caroline Levitt moved. It wasn't sudden. It was careful, like standing in a place where the floor might collapse beneath you if you shifted your weight too fast. She placed one hand on the table, pressed herself upward, and stood. Her blazer, perfectly tailored and once pristine, now looked slightly rumpled near the hem where her hands had clenched. She didn't straighten it. She didn't smooth her skirt. For the first time all day, she didn't adjust her appearance for the lens, because this wasn't performance anymore. This was aftermath. She turned toward the exit, the same door Crockett had disappeared through not long before. The silence in the room followed her like a shadow. Some aides glanced at her as she passed. Others looked away. There was no applause, no heckling, no recognition, just the weight of what had been said and what hadn't. As she walked, the sound of her heels on marble echoed far too loud in a room meant for deliberation, not judgment. And now judgment had come, not from a vote, not from a committee, but from the collapse of her own narrative under the weight of a truth she didn't refute. She reached the threshold, paused, then turned her head just slightly, just enough to see the hearing room one last time. The empty chair where Crockett had sat, the USB still glinting under the overhead lights, the walls of power now echoing with a voice that refused to be silenced. Levitt didn't speak, but her eyes, hollow, uncertain, said what she couldn't. It's not over, because it wasn't. Everyone in the room knew it. Every reporter sensed it. Every aide could feel it in the tension still hanging overhead like an unresolved cord. This wasn't a conclusion. It was a fracture, a new beginning carved from something broken. The hearing may have ended, but the questions it raised, the recordings, the choices, the cost of silence, had only just begun their descent into the bloodstream of American politics. Levitt stepped out of the chamber and into a hallway filled with silence. No cameras waited, no prepared statement, just the distant echo of her own footsteps. She didn't know if she'd return to that room, but she knew the next time she entered, she wouldn't be the one holding the script. She'd be the one answering it. And behind her, the door swung slowly shut. Not like an ending, but like a promise. This story wasn't finished. It had just found its teeth. As the chamber doors closed behind Levitt and silence settled over the Capitol, the noise outside was just beginning. Not in Washington, but in the wild terrain of a divided nation now staring at itself in digital reflection. The moment the hearing adjourned, the internet detonated. Within minutes, screenshots of the USB drive lit up every platform. Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube. Clips of Crockett's fiery monologue, her trembling voice as she whispered, "This is the proof. And you know it," were spliced into montages soundtracked by swelling violins and cinematic bass drops. Opposing narratives formed with surgical speed, carving the country into digital factions that saw the same story through violently different eyes. The world wasn't watching the aftermath of a hearing. It was living inside the beginning of something larger, something dangerous, something unresolved. On one side of the internet, she was a heroine, Crockett, the flame that forced the truth into daylight. Tweets exploded with praise, many accompanied by hashtags like "Justice is not silent" and "Let the truth burn." Activists changed their profile photos to Crockett, standing, arm extended, USB in hand, like a prosecutor or a prophet. A single clip of her slamming her hand on the desk looped endlessly, each replay intensifying her defiance, her courage, her fury. Reddit threads dissected every frame of her body language. Influencers recorded reaction videos with teary eyes saying things like, "Finally, someone said it. Someone didn't flinch." But on the other side, a colder narrative solidified. Levitt, the ice that didn't crack. Supporters lauded her restraint, calling her a model of composure under siege. Conservative media outlets flooded the airwaves with admiration for her refusal to take the bait. She didn't shout, one viral post read. She didn't fold. She represented every American tired of being told what to think. Clips of Levitt's soft-spoken line, "I won't deny it. There are things I don't control," were reposted with titles like "The Calm That Held in Grace Under Fire." Right-wing pundits described her as a steel spine in a sea of hysteria. And then, at the center of the storm, the hashtag that united both sides in conflict: Crockett and Levitt. In under 3 hours, it trended at #1 in 7 countries. Alongside it, a second tag emerged and surged, one that would become a symbol, a dividing line, a rally cry. The USB millions demanded to hear the full recording. Op-eds flooded news sites from every ideological direction, some warning of deep state weaponization, others crying out for immediate prosecution. Politicians took to their own social feeds. Representative Alston from California tweeted, "This USB may be the modern-day Pentagon Papers." Senator Royce from Texas responded, "It's a flash drive full of feelings. The real threat is the emotion, not the evidence." Lines were drawn. Legislators from both parties scrambled to react, with draft bills already circulating by midnight, some calling for new AI transparency mandates in government communication, others for stricter oversight of social media content pushed by state-run algorithms. But something deeper had cracked open, something beyond legislation. A cultural question reemerged, not from the courts, but from comment sections, podcast microphones, and late-night debate panels. Freedom of speech, but freedom for whom? The phrase echoed in headlines in coffee shops, in faculty lounges and barber chairs. Parents whispered it during school drop-offs. Veterans posted it beneath folded flags. Teenagers turned it into TikTok duets. And for the first time in recent memory, both sides paused, not to agree, but to admit they were no longer sure who had won. Crockett had cornered the truth, yes. Levitt had stood her ground, yes. But something about the confrontation refused to settle into the binary trap of victory and defeat. There was no clean ending. Just pressure, just fracture, just the realization that truth and control no longer lived on opposite ends of the battlefield, but often shared the same weapons. Across late-night news, analysts leaned into the camera with furrowed brows. This wasn't just a political flashpoint, one commentator said on national television. This was moral combustion. Another added, "It's no longer about whether the USB was real. It's about whether we still care who holds the match." By sunrise the next day, memes flooded timelines. Crockett framed in fire, Levitt frozen in profile. The flame in the ice, they called it, like myth, like prophecy. A billboard company in Atlanta reportedly offered free space to broadcast a rotating loop of the confrontation in 4K. Universities announced emergency panels to discuss truth in the digital age. Churches rewrote Sunday sermons around the hearing's language. A public school teacher in Illinois printed out Crockett's quote, "You don't get to sit there and call that freedom," and taped it across the classroom bulletin board. And still, no one knew what came next. Because the file was real, and DOJ had it, and Crockett had walked away with no smile, no wave, just a trail of undeniable impact. Levitt had exited in silence, but her defenders grew louder by the hour. The USB, now under federal review, became more than a device. It became a mirror. A mirror held up not to the women, but to the country. Because at its heart, this wasn't just about two opponents. It was about what happens when truth, fear, and power share the same oxygen. And America, watching, posting, arguing, was left to ask itself, who do we believe? Who gets to speak? And what happens when the cost of listening becomes too high to ignore? The screen never fades to black. The credits don't roll, because this isn't over. This was never just a hearing. It was the spark. And now the fire has names. The hearing room had emptied, but the impact had not. Long after Jasmine Crockett's footsteps disappeared down the corridor and the cameras cut back to commentary, the Capitol remained unnervingly quiet. Not in the way that follows order, but in the way that follows disruption. A stillness that settles only after a fault line shifts. Inside the marbled halls of power, where portraits of dead lawmakers watched over whispered deals, something unfamiliar began to creep in. Doubt. Not public doubt. Not the kind that trended on social media or made it into editorials. No, this was internal. This was the slow, creeping realization among staffers, strategists, and senior counsel that the line between control and collapse had just narrowed, and that Jasmine Crockett, with a voice calm as steel and a question sharp as glass, had done what few others had managed. She had made the machine flinch. It began in offices where televisions had been muted out of habit but suddenly flicked back on. Assistants paused with coffee trays in hand, watching replays of that final exchange. Were you the people's prosecutor or just a private attorney for the wealthy who could pay for protection? The room would go silent. No one laughed. No one deflected. That sentence wasn't a zinger. It was a wedge, and it was sinking into every crevice of a city long built on plausible deniability. At the Office of Congressional Ethics, phones began to ring, not with outrage, but with requests. Staffers asking for precedent, general counsel asking for case files on similar conflicts. Memos were drafted, private meetings scheduled, no official announcement, no red banners. But behind every closed mahogany door, something was shifting. People were trying to get ahead of the fallout before it spread beyond Bondi. Because if she could fall under the weight of evidence in one unwavering voice, then who else might? In committee offices down the hall, Republican aides were quietly scrubbing statements. The same talking points that had been prepared to defend Bondi were now quietly shelved, replaced by vague affirmations of supporting full transparency and allowing the process to unfold. One senior staffer, who had helped craft the media response days before, now sat at his desk with his blazer off and his sleeves rolled up, staring at the pause frame of Jasmine Crockett on the committee livestream. "We underestimated her," he muttered. No one disagreed. And it wasn't just the political class that felt the tremor. Across D.C., at think tanks, PR firms, and corporate law offices, the implications were being unpacked like live grenades. People weren't just asking, "What did Bondi do?" They were asking, "How long has this been normal?" The pattern had existed for years. Donors laundering influence through nonprofits, prosecutors exercising discretion, investigations dying in the dark. But now with one document, one witness, one line of questioning, the veil had been pulled back. It wasn't scandal anymore. It was structure, and Crockett had drawn the blueprint in blood-red ink. At the Department of Justice, a deputy chief quietly reached for an older file on Trump University that had never been followed up. The file was thick but incomplete, missing statements, missing notes. His finger hovered over the intercom before he pressed it. "Get me the archive log, and bring up the list of communications between Florida AG and Trump org." He didn't know what he'd find, but now, thanks to Crockett, not knowing was no longer acceptable. At law schools across the country, the moment became curriculum before the day ended. Professors interrupted their pre-planned lectures on constitutional theory to play the hearing back. Students leaned forward, not with curiosity, but investment. One professor at Georgetown paused after Crockett's final question and simply asked, "What do we do when the system fails to check itself, until someone outside the system demands it to?" The classroom stayed quiet, not because they didn't know, but because they did. Because they saw in Crockett something they hadn't seen in decades. Not rebellion against the rule of law, but a return to its purpose. At Howard University, a group of young women gathered outside the library. Some were law students, others undergrads. Most were black. They didn't talk about Bondi. They talked about Jasmine, about the way she didn't raise her voice, but rose above it, about how she'd sat there, surrounded by centuries of privilege, and carved out space for the truth, not by yelling, but by refusing to blink. One freshman looked up from her phone and said quietly, "She didn't just speak for herself. She spoke for us." The others nodded. That was the echo now. Crockett wasn't just heard, she was felt. And yet, through all the digital noise, through the legal shockwaves and political recalibrations, Jasmine Crockett herself remained silent. She didn't go on MSNBC. She didn't post a victory thread on Twitter. Her office issued no statement because she understood something too many forgot. Justice is loud when it's real, and it doesn't need a mic check. She had entered that hearing not to perform, but to pierce, and she had done so with surgical precision. Anything more would only dilute the wound she had forced the system to look at. Inside the Capitol, as the sun dipped low and shadows stretched long across the marble, one final conversation played out behind closed doors in the Speaker's private conference room. A senior majority leader sat with his policy chief, both men older, seasoned, cynical. They watched the clip again. Crockett's question, Bondi's silence, the chairman's gavel. "She didn't flinch," the leader said. "Not once." His aide nodded. "She can't be ignored anymore." There was a pause. Then the leader leaned forward, setting his glass down. "No, she can't, and neither can what she just made visible." They didn't speak again, because they knew. In this town, things rarely change in a day. But some days start something no one can stop. The Department of Justice confirmed the flash drive's authenticity on a rainy Tuesday morning. There was no press conference, no dramatic podium speech. Just a cold two-paragraph memo quietly posted to the DOJ website at 9:17 a.m. It read like a formality, clinical, devoid of emotion, but its final line hit like a detonation. The contents are verified and under active review. Within an hour, every major news outlet had pushed alerts to tens of millions of phones. Every newsroom in the country went into overdrive. Journalists refreshed sources, lawyers circled like vultures, and politicians, on both sides, scrambled to rewrite their public stances. But the American people didn't need more headlines. They had already seen the hearing. They had watched Jasmine Crockett hold up that USB like a moral indictment. They had witnessed Caroline Leavitt's hands finally tremble. And now, with DOJ confirmation, what had once been a symbolic gesture became a legal threat. This wasn't a congressional hearing anymore. This was a case. And the defendant wasn't just an administration, it was the story America had been telling itself about freedom. Across the country, the question that once sat politely in philosophy textbooks and civics classes now felt like a live wire in every home. What does free speech mean when it becomes a shield for deception? On Capitol Hill, the mood turned inward, paranoid. Members of Congress who had sat silently through the hearing began requesting classified briefings. Staffers were pulled from media interviews and told to hold the line. Behind closed doors, internal memos leaked revealing that multiple agencies had been using AI-driven filters to monitor narrative trends, not to stop disinformation, but to redirect it. The buzzword in the documents, strategic diffusion, translation, let the storm spread, then drown it in noise. Now the noise had faces. One of them was Jasmine Crockett, the other was Caroline Leavitt. But the courtroom of public opinion had shifted its gaze. No longer locked on just two women, it now scrutinized every institution, every agency, every elected official who had for years told the public, "We've got this under control." They didn't. A CNN analyst put it plainly, "This is no longer about two women. This is about a system that knew the fire was spreading and chose to dim the lights instead of sounding the alarm." In Texas, Crockett's home district became a pilgrimage site of sorts. Protesters gathered outside her office, not to demand action, but to thank her. They held signs that read, "You said what we lived. Truth is louder now." This USB is a lifeline. Some placed flowers. Others left names. On scraps of paper, envelopes, even handwritten letters. Names of sons, daughters, friends who had spiraled into rabbit holes of online lies and never come back. Some overdosed. Some turned violent. Some simply disappeared from reality, convinced that the people closest to them were enemies of the state. This wasn't ideology anymore. This was trauma. And across the aisle, Leavitt's defenders doubled down. Not all in words, many remained silent, but in posture. Conservative PACs launched new campaigns with slogans like, "The First Amendment doesn't apologize," and "Freedom doesn't flinch." She became a symbol, not of policy, but of philosophical purity. The idea that even if the system is flawed, it is not the job of the government to referee belief. To many, it sounded noble. To others, it sounded like abdication. A cultural war reignited, not just between left and right, but between those who believed in protection through intervention and those who believed in protection through restraint. Both claimed to defend liberty, but their definitions were now irreconcilable. Meanwhile, the Justice Department began subpoenaing internal White House emails and meeting logs. A federal grand jury was quietly convened in D.C. No charges were announced, but leaks began trickling into the press, emails referencing narrative suppression protocol, Slack transcripts from senior advisors debating the benefit of plausible distance, and one internal memo stamped urgent that read, "Do not use the term burial, replace with organic content prioritization." The flash drive was no longer a symbol, it was evidence. And that meant something more disturbing. Someone in power had authorized the lie. Not a rogue employee, not a glitch, a directive. Now the question echoed louder than ever. Who signed the order? The country sat stunned, not because it didn't suspect, but because it finally had proof that what it feared was real. The manipulation wasn't always through force. Sometimes it wore the mask of freedom. Sometimes it spoke softly, like Levitt. Sometimes it screamed, like Crockett. And now, with DOJ and congressional oversight committees racing to investigate, the fire that started in one hearing room was burning into every federal office with a search history. The media, once fractured along partisan lines, began to converge around one truth. This wasn't just about disinformation. This was about democracy's immune system failing, and no one noticing until the infection had spread. PBS aired a special titled, "The Moment the Algorithm Turned Against Us." The New York Times ran an op-ed titled, "Freedom Isn't Free, It's Fragile." Fox News aired a town hall called "Silenced or Protected, The Price of Truth." No one agreed, but no one turned away. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett declined every major interview request. When approached on Capitol grounds by a reporter who asked if she felt vindicated, she paused and replied, "I don't care about being right. I care about what's left." Caroline Leavitt remained silent. No tweets, no statements. But a close staffer, speaking anonymously, told The Hill, "She's not finished. She's watching, waiting. And when she speaks again, it won't be from a defensive posture. It'll be a counterstrike." And so the nation held its breath, because this was no longer a fight over what had already happened. This was the beginning of a trial, not in court, not in Congress, but in the soul of a country that finally had to ask itself, when everyone has a voice and no one protects the truth, who pays the price? And slowly, like dawn rising over a battlefield still littered with smoke and echoes, the country understood. It was not a question of who had won the hearing. It was a question of who would survive what came next. As investigations deepened and the country braced for whatever storm would follow, one truth remained untouched by politics or headlines. What Jasmine Crockett unleashed in that hearing was more than a scandal. It was a question of conscience. And questions like that don't go away. They echo. The lesson didn't come wrapped in applause. It didn't end with a gavel or a headline. It came in the silence that followed the fire, when the speeches faded, when the microphones clicked off, and all that remained was the raw, unanswerable cost of a truth long buried. Jasmine Crockett didn't fight because it was politically convenient. She fought because she knew what it meant to lose someone to a lie. She knew the hollow ache of watching a friend fall into the darkness of online delusion, of seeing fact replaced with fury, of watching a nation numb itself to suffering just because the algorithm called it freedom. And in that hearing room, surrounded by suits and silence, she did what few ever do. She refused to speak politely when reality demanded she scream. Her tears were not weakness. They were evidence. Proof that courage isn't always calm. Sometimes it's messy. Sometimes it's loud. And sometimes it's a black woman in a red blazer, standing alone in a room designed to erase her voice, demanding that someone, anyone, look her in the eye and call injustice by its name. The human lesson wasn't in the policy. It wasn't in the legality of the USB or the ethics of free speech. It was in the space between two truths, that silence can protect dignity, but it can also protect deception, and that the cost of restraint is sometimes paid in lives, not votes. The hearing reminded us that freedom is not sterile. It's not elegant. It's not always comfortable. It is fragile and it bleeds. And when we confuse volume with validity, when we mistake control for composure, we lose something vital, not just in the institutions we build, but in the people we become. Jasmine Crockett stood up that day, not because she had the perfect argument, but because she had something more dangerous, Memory, memory of harm, memory of loss, and memory, when fused with purpose, doesn't just speak, it ignites. So if there is one lesson that echoes beyond the chaos, it is this. Truth is not neutral, and silence is never as innocent as it pretends to be. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.